Oh, we start over. I call to order this special meeting of the Winston-Salem City Council on November 17th, 2020. And pursuant to the policy and procedures adopted by the City Council, this meeting has been carried out by virtual meeting protocols. I've determined that it's not feasible for the City Council and I to meet together physically, and due to the safer at home order, all council members are participating virtually. Council members will vote by roll call. If a vote is taken, a council member will be recognized. They'll raise their hand and state their vote. Would the City Clerk please call the roll?
Councilmember Larson.
Present.
Councilmember Clark. Councilmember Bessie.
Here.
Councilmember Scipio.
Present.
Mayor Pro Tem Adams.
Here.
Councilmember Taylor.
Present.
Councilmember McIntosh.
Here.
Councilmember Parman.
Here.
Thank you. Would please join the City Council and me in a moment of silence. Thank you. I do want to call out the name of Mr. Jim Shaw, who passed away last night. Jim, as you know, was a great community leader here, business leader, civic leader, and did a lot for our community. And we certainly extend our thoughts and prayers to his family today. Today's agenda, City Council is comprised of the following items. There's a report on the Community Investments Review Committee and their recommendations. There's a budget forecast, as well as a report on the community agency funding process. The meeting is being televised live on TV 13, and it will be replayed Wednesday at 9:30 a.m. and again at 9 p.m. Copies of the City Council's agenda and previous meeting videos are always available online at the city's website, and just click on the Watch Meetings Online option. Council members, we have 3 items to go through tonight. The first one with the Community Investments Review Committee recommendations, we will need to, I think, give some direction back to the staff on that and in terms of moving forward. And then the report on the community agency funding process, not take a formal vote on that, but again, I think some feedback to the staff would be welcome in that. So we may have the first item, please, Ms. Keeney.
Community Investments Review Committee recommendations.
Our Budget and Evaluation Director, I believe Ms. Tony, is going to review that or begin that.
Yes, good afternoon, Mayor Jones, Mayor Pro Tem Adams, members of the City Council.
Can't really hear you, Ms. Tony.
We could hear you, Miss Tony. You might just have a volume that you need to turn it up.
Okay, how about now? Is that better?
Yes.
Is that better? Okay.
A little bit.
All right, I'll try to speak loudly. I apologize for that. Okay, so good evening to the Mayor Jones, Mayor Pro Tem Adams, members of the City Council, and council members elect. Okay, so I'm Patrice Tony, Budget and Evaluation Director, and the Citizens and the Investment Review Committee met for about 3 months. And so what I'll do is review the process. I do want to acknowledge Chair Claudette Bailey is not able to be with us today. She had an injury and had recent surgery. I do want to acknowledge the Vice Chair, Ken Pettigrew, is with us. And so I'll review the process and then he will review the recommendations. Gosh. Mayor, if you can go to the next slide. Okay, so the charge of the committee was to make recommendations for $1 million for equity package by October the 1st. That deadline was extended till the end of October. The recommendations were around social justice and anti-poverty initiatives. Next slide. The committee was appointed by the mayor and the city council. The chairs were Ms. Claudette Bailey and Vice Chair Kenneth Pettigrew. You can see that each ward, each council member selected 2 community members to serve on the committee, and there were 2 at-large members selected by the mayor. Next slide. The committee was given resources. They received a presentation that the Vice Chair Pettigrew reviewed. He reviewed defining social justice and poverty. The committee also received a copy of the poverty force report and their recommendations. The committee also received a list of city-funded resources that address social justice and poverty. Next slide. So the process is that the committee created and developed some project ideas. They completed a Google form, edited many of their project ideas, and then voted on them. From there, they came up with project categories. I'll work on my item after I get to Ken's part. So sorry about that. But the project categories were discussed and came out of the Google form. And then there was a scorecard where the committee voted on the recommendations. Next slide. Okay, so at this time, Ken will review the categories for the recommendations.
Good afternoon, everyone. Mayor Joines, Mayor Pro Tem Adams, and members of the City Council. So the committee formed these particular categories, and our final vote on these categories was, in fact, unanimous. And so the categories are such: grants for social justice and anti-poverty initiatives, $200,000. Long-term anti-poverty and social justice strategies, $200,000. Broadband internet access expansion and training for $300,000. Heritage preservation and education, $190,000. And mentorship and neighborhood capacity building for $110,000, all totaling to $1 million.
Okay, I understand Ms. Tony is trying to call in to kind of improve the audio. While we're waiting on her, any questions of Mr. Pettigrew on the category recommendations?
Mayor, I have a question for Mr. Pettigrew.
Yes, Mr. Taylor, and then Councilman Parman after that.
Mr. Pettigrew, it looks like $300,000 for broadband internet access expansion and training. Can you talk to us a little bit about the thought process behind the committee when they made this suggestion and recommendation?
So this particular recommendation came in light of just long-term realizations around access to broadband internet in our community, that there is a difference between being able to access internet service and then there being certain other kind of infrastructural things in place in order for that service to be at its best, particularly when you're thinking about issues of virtual learning, and other things. Long term, it's also about the fact that job seeking, job searching is all moving much more digitally, and that there's just much more digital engagement that has to happen for employment. So thinking about general access issues, members of the committee presented this idea, and it went through several iterations before it came to this particular point. But the committee did see value in it as an investment in something longer term, that would allow folks to have continued access to broadband internet and the ability to participate in the economy and other things in that way.
In this category, we're proposing to allocate the highest amount of money. So I just wanted Mr. Pettigrew to briefly mention that just in case any questions came up.
Thank you, Mr. Taylor. Councilmember Parman, you had a question to Mr. Pettigrew?
I do. So about the broadband and the $300,000 and the infrastructure. So one thing that I was under the impression of when asking about the $1 million with the CERC money was this was one-time funding. So with this being one-time funding, who's going to carry the bill for this broadband of $300,000 after it's put in place? Is that going to fall under the city? Because I caught the part where you threw in it'd be employment purposes, but I also caught the part where you threw in it was for schools. So are y'all banking on the city to fork the bill of this broadband, or are you all banking on the county to carry that bill after that infrastructure is put in place, Mr. Pettigrew?
As far as maintenance and things of that nature for the infrastructure put in place is concerned, the committee did not make any particular recommendations about for whom that responsibility or with whom that responsibility would fall. I believe that the recommendation in its original intent was to place and provide infrastructure that may or may not exist in certain parts of our community. What that looks like following that point, I believe, is to the discretion of both the city council and leaders otherwise.
Okay. So for me, based on the information you just provided, I can't support the $300,000 for the broadband. But for this long term, for social justice and anti-poverty, what does that look like? I know you're talking about hiring someone to put in a position of some of the sort. So can you give me a little bit of information back behind that, please?
Certainly. Part of the reality that the committee discussed at length is the fact that this is in fact a one-time investment. And so that required some thinking about that $1 million is a finite amount of money, and it's actually not a particularly large amount when we think about the kinds of things that we're attempting to address here. So with that, the members of the committee did recommend considering a process in a way to where we can look at longer term realities for the city as an institution and for the community as a whole. So that pot of money in particular would go to possibly looking at ways that social justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion realities can be addressed and audited within the city itself, and therefore possibly creating space to fund longer term a position based on how things are being spent or how things are going on, to fund someone who will be specifically looking at those things on behalf of the city and the community. So the idea ultimately is that, yes, a person would be hired possibly as some kind of social justice coordinator or something of that nature, but that funding, hopefully, to continue and long-term fund that would come from reductions in spending in other places that are not serving to make the city of Winston-Salem, both as institution and as a community, the most diverse, equitable, and full of inclusion that it could be.
Okay, one more thing. I'm sorry, Mr. Mayor, Mayor Pro Temp, I see you. One more thing. So with that being said, with the long-term, and listen to what you said, even with the mentorship and the way y'all came up with the categories, y'all was given the Mayor's Poverty Thought Force Initiative. And also with the city, we already have the African American Heritage Initiative, the Commission of Ending Homelessness, the Urban Food Policy Council. So we have all of these other committees. Did the Citizens Investment Review Committee think to try to look at how we could better orchestrate or fund the initiatives that's already put in place without reinventing the wheel?
Yes, and that is why we came up with categories and not program recommendations. That there's a realization that there are already organizations or groups that may be a part of the city or not that are doing particular types of work around social justice and anti-poverty. And so investments would be able to be made into those organizations, or increased resources made available for committees or groups that already exist, in order for that work to be expanded and to continue doing the work it needs to do.
Thank you. I think we're going to talk a little bit about that in phase 2 in just a moment. Ms. Tony's going to cover that. And just before I'm going to get right to you, Councilmember Bessie and Councilmember Adams, Mayor Pro Tem Adams. Mr. Pettigrew, my understanding is on the broadband, the idea is to create somewhat of a pilot program there and be able to demonstrate how this might work on a broader scale at a later time.
Can you all hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, great. I just want to jump in about the broadband internet access. Our IS Director, Tom Koreska, actually worked a little bit with the subcommittee for broadband. The idea was to have a pilot, this to be a pilot to identify neighborhoods that didn't have any type of broadband high-speed internet access, because internet access and Wi-Fi is one thing, but the high speed is a difference. He's looking more at running off of the city's existing infrastructure and kind of developing the lines and the connections there. I think Councilmember Parman has made some great comments in terms of just long term, but as long as the infrastructure is there and people have access, that would be the goal. And then once that is a successful program, to somehow solicit private partnerships to maybe duplicate that particular program.
Thank you, Ms. Tony. That's very, very helpful. Councilmember Bessie.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Pettigrew, I was going to ask about the difference between the grants for social justice anti-poverty initiatives and the category for long-term anti-poverty social justice strategies. You addressed that in addressing Councilmember Parman's questions. Let me see if I get it. The grants are anticipated as, in essence, immediate assistance to community groups that apply through a process, and it would go out sort of in the field in the community right away. Whereas the long-term strategies category is intended to be work that the city itself would do. Is that a simplified take on it?
Yes.
All right, thanks. Could you elaborate a little more on that fourth category, heritage preservation and education? I'm not sure I understand how that fits within the anti-poverty social justice framework. So I'd appreciate your explanation. Thank you.
So in terms of committee discussion, there are already several initiatives around heritage preservation and things going on. Councilmember Parman mentioned one of the initiatives that's already happening. And the committee felt it important, given the realities that help to propel this process forward to begin with, that part of the way that we continue to successfully empower and truly create opportunity for folks to continue rising from poverty and to do the work of social justice is that there is an immediate requirement in terms of that for education. And part of the way that we do that is we have to be upfront about the history and the realities that we have encountered here in Winston-Salem. And part of the way we do that is we preserve that heritage and we use it as a teaching tool, not just for African Americans and people of color, but for the entire community, as a way that we begin some kind of baseline education around how social justice and poverty are connected and how we can do the work together as a community to begin to fix those issues.
Okay, so you're not necessarily talking about a physical heritage preservation so much as a community education effort?
The answer, it's a both and.
Both and.
That physical preservation is a reality. So some kind of physical space for that work, that continuing education work, to be based out of and to continue going on.
All right, thank you.
Mayor Pro Tem Adams.
Yes, thank you, Mayor, members of the council, and council member-elects and the staff. First of all, thank you, Mr. Pettigrew, and all of the citizens that participated in this process on our behalf. I know your work was not easy. You all got a chance to see kind of how our work is, that it's kind of difficult to land on everything and still be productive and efficient. I really hate that I did not get a little bit more put input or give my side of kind of help with this process, because my thing is, I granted the name of the game is to get the money out. And I think we, unfortunately, we've kind of not been productive in that sense. And Mr. Pettigrew, it is not the CERT committee's fault on that. It's government. That's how slow it works. And it's just unfortunate. Again, I'd like to possibly have seen, and that's now later, might have never, shoulda, or coulda, or will happen, is the connectivity to everything that we're already doing. That we can connect with other partners in the community. As you all know, I'm attending the city summit for the National League of Cities right now. In the board meeting today, they asked to the poll of what were the major things that cities would like to see happen now, even with the government, the feds, the state. And everybody landed on the same, basically, 4 things. And the first thing was infrastructure. And that infrastructure encompassed transportation, mass transit, getting people marginalized to and from wherever they need to go, and broadband, high-speed internet. The other one was on building equity capacity, ensuring that people, everyone, particularly marginalized people, Black folk, brown folk, have an opportunity to a quality of life. In naming all of this, Mayor, members of the council, and to this committee and staff, I know they had a hard job. I got all kinds of phone calls. People wasn't happy, whatever. But I'm wondering if we're really going to make a difference if these are prototype launches, as Councilmember Parman. This is not the end all be all. This is not the magic bullet. Basically, I think that these initiatives are basically, Mayor, prototype launches of initiatives. And the main thing is, how do we ensure the community stakeholders in this get to do this versus, as we know, government and others. It's got to be the community stakeholders inside out, and it's got to be the people that the subject matter experts and have been doing the work. That's all I got to say, because whatever decision the council lands on, I'd be surprised if 50% of our citizens think we did a good job on this process, and hopefully we will learn from it so we can be better. And hopefully I'm going to be looking for other cities once this meeting's over and the rest of the meeting, the conference, to give them an idea of what we're doing here. And maybe somebody else has already done this, and maybe we can benchmark or copy what they're doing.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. And let's keep in mind that these are broad categories here. There's no program pieces to those. And Ms. Tony's going to describe the next phase on how proposals will be solicited to tie into these broad categories, if you will. We got 3 more people. If we could, let's keep our thoughts to questions for Mr. Pettigrew at this point. Councilmember McIntosh.
Well, maybe this isn't appropriate. I just wanted to throw my weight behind the broadband internet access expansion and training. Mayor Pro Tem Adams serves on a National League of Cities. I serve on the North Carolina League of Municipalities. Broadband access is way up the chart on both these organizations, mainly geared towards rural capacity, but we really need to have it for urban capacity. So I'm very much in favor of that. I also think it's something fairly sexy that we can get industry to partner with us. I think it's something that we can draw a lot of money in around a good, well-designed program.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. We saw the impact of that when the school system went remote and had like 5,000 students could not log on. Councilmember Clark.
Yeah, just real quickly. Last night we approved, I think it was $1.3 million to go out and ask organizations in the community how they would spend it to help folks right now. And I believe I asked last night, they said we hope to have those organizations' responses back by January. To echo what the mayor just said, keep in mind, the next step is we're going to go ask folks to give us requests for proposals on these categories. So we will have a lot of different categories and suggestions to pick from. So I would caution anyone not to prejudge what's going to happen here until we actually get proposals, and then we'll be better able to see where we want to go with it. Thank you.
All right, Councilman Larson, did I see your hand?
Yes, I would just like to go on to phase 2. I think this is exactly what needs to be done is to get beyond the.
Good, thank you. All right, Ms. Tony, if you want to then take us to the next step there, please.
Yes. Okay. So phase 2, the proposed phase 2 would include a potential request for proposal. Since we have categories, category 1 and the last category, both will require communities to apply for fundings in those categories. Actually, all 4 of the categories would allow for that. Once the RFPs are in, the applications would be reviewed and scored. So council, or you can direct staff, can decide if we have an existing community agency allocations committee who's capable of reviewing and scoring, or we can try to bring in some CERT committee members. Some of the committee members only committed to 3 months, and so I know we couldn't seek the entire committee to be a part of reviewing. So we can determine who would review and score those applications. Then all of the recommendations would go to council for approval. We would then draw up contractual agreements and then make sure that the original CERT committee gets updates and a final report on all of the agencies that were selected in this process to receive funding.
Thank you. Any questions for Ms. Tony about the proposed phase 2? All right, thank you. I think I sense a fairly good consensus, but I think if the council was comfortable, I'd entertain a motion to endorse the concept of the 5 categories and the process for phase 2.
So moved, Mayor.
Thank you. Is there a second? Okay, Councilmember Taylor, and I believe seconded by Councilmember Clark, I believe. Yep. I'll do a roll. Any discussion on that? Councilmember Bessie.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just a couple of comments, but yeah, I will support this motion. I think that we asked the Citizen Committee to do a fairly impossible task with a limited amount of funding, and that they made a credible effort and credible recommendations, and I appreciate all their work. Since I don't anticipate that I will be well, in fact, since I'm confident that these will not get back to the council during my term on council, I just want to leave with a couple thoughts. One being regarding that second category of long-term strategies, I personally will be quite disappointed if the council chooses to put that money into hiring somebody else to think more about poverty and social justice issues for us. We've done a lot of that already. I would be much happier if I see the council put that money into projects that will support some of the outstanding initiatives that have been developed over time that could use more money, like the SOAR and the reentry efforts. I think that would be a very good use of what is admittedly a limited amount of funding. With that, I will step back and vote for the motion and thank all the members of the committee, Mr. Pettigrew, and all of your colleagues for your hard work. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Councilman Bessie. The motion before you, Council, is to approve and endorse the concept of the 5 categories and the process for phase 2. Before we take the vote, Councilmember Taylor wanted to make a comment.
Yeah, I just want to thank the committee, the CERT committee, for taking the time to do this work. I want to thank the council for approving this $1 million. Now, we're always going to get people who say we should have done more. And I guess the answer to that is, hey, I'd like to do more, but $1 million is definitely a step in the right direction, putting this equity package together to address social justice and anti-poverty issues. And I just want to say to the community and to the council, there's 2 things going on at the same time. Right now, we're dealing with a pandemic, particularly COVID-19, but we're also dealing with social justice issues while we're dealing with the pandemic. So this is an opportunity to level the playing field on both issues. It's a step in the right direction, and I'm happy that we're able to sort of get this done and move to phase 2.
Thank you, Councilman Taylor. Councilman Larson, you had a comment.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. I'd like to just reiterate thanks to Patrice Tony for her work on this, and then the committee as a whole. I think have done an exceptionally well job to frame the conversation. We're going to, I assume, be getting a number of proposals from the community at large, which is the engagement I believe that Mayor Pro Tem Adams was asking for, to get more community involvement. I do have one technical question to ask, though, and that is, how firm are we to these exact numbers? In other words, when the grants come in, we've allocated $200,000 grants for social justice and anti-poverty. If we get $180,000, for example, do we have the liberty to move some money around at this point? And assuming that all of these proposals are going to come back to council at some point for individual approval.
Mr. Larson, I think the council setting the categories, and you can change the categories. I mean,
can adjust slight adjustments
if a majority feels that's appropriate. Councilor Scipio.
Thank you. I do want to say thank you to all of the committee members. I often listen into their meetings, and I heard their concerns and their struggles. And so I'm very happy that they were able to bring something back to us for consideration. But my concern was what Councilmember Larson raised about the limits in these categories. I'm concerned that we may have some phenomenal proposals and we may need to shift the funding because they don't fit into one of these categories. We may not have enough proposals for any one. So I hope we'll be flexible enough to know that we can move that money around.
Thank you, Councilor Scipio. If you're prepared, we'll vote on the motion to endorse the concept of the 5 categories and the process for phase 2. Councilor Larson.
Yes.
Councilor Clark.
Yes.
Councilor Bessie.
Yes.
Councilor Scipio.
Yes.
Mayor Pro Tem Adams.
Yes.
Councilmember Taylor.
Yeah.
Councilmember McIntosh.
Aye.
And Councilmember Parker.
Aye.
Thank you. Let me add my thanks to the committee for all the hard work. I know it was an extraordinary task that you all undertook. So now we'll move to the next part, which is the early budget forecast. Ms. Tony.
Yes, thank you, Mayor. So at this time, we'll review the early budget forecast. This is earlier than typical. Typically, we have an early budget forecast in February, but we thought it was important for you all to kind of be aware of where we are just in the middle of still a pandemic. So first, we'll start off with the year-end actuals. We'll look at current year and then look at the early forecast and some of the other funds. So looking at how we ended FY20, we budgeted $211.9 million. We plan to we budgeted $2 million in fund balance to spend, and so we actually spent $2.4 million in fund balance for year end. Looking at our general fund balance, this chart shows our actual for June 30th of 2019. So we had a general fund balance of $51.5 million. And for June of 30th of 2020, our actual was $49 million for our fund balance. As you can see, we had 22.1 is restricted, 21.5 million is our reserve, and then we actually appropriated $5.4 million that's here in the yellow. So available fund balance is at 21.5 million, and that is at 10.06. So just to show you a little bit of our history of our general fund balance reserve policy, you can see starting in 2000, our general fund balance policy was at 10%, and each year we were above that in our reserves. At 2012, we went up in 2013 to 12% and stayed there until 2015, and then in 2016 we went up to 14% for our general fund balance policy. And as you notice, we dipped below our fund balance policy, and so you can see the last dot is down, and it's at that 10.06 that you saw on the previous chart. And so this is really critical. If we have a winter storm, if this current year we have to use an additional fund balance more than the 5.4 million that we budgeted, this would put us pretty low and close to our legal limit, which is 8%. So looking at the current year, it's still early, but this is a snapshot of our revenues over expenditures. As you can see, the yellow graph is the fund balance that we budgeted, the 5.43 million, and then we have 209 million of ongoing revenues. Our expenditures, it's not balanced, there's a $1 million gap, and that is due to an increase in the expenditure side, but it's for the fairground subsidy. As you recall, we did not have a fair, and so that subsidy has declined, and so we will add $1 million the current year to that fund ground fund. So this chart is, we saw this in the revenue update. There are a few questions around our revenues. So I just wanted to quickly review this. And actually here you'll see our revenues and expenditures. And this is probably not the latest chart, but anyway. Property tax, no change. As I mentioned earlier, our sales tax has increased more than what we projected. License and permits, that there's no change in that from our budgeted. Intergovernmental revenues, this is utility sales tax, gasoline tax, beer and wine tax, ABC store allocations. And so I mentioned earlier that our ABC store allocations are up, and they're doing well, but this category also includes the utilities sales tax, and so there is a significant decline in that category, and so you'll see a minus 2.7% there. Charges for services, that category is parking meter revenue, charges to the state, to the county, and so forth. It's not much change there. In this other revenues, this is what was brought up in the revenue update. That is rental sales, fines, and forfeitures. But a big piece of that, there's a miscellaneous category, and that was due to the phase out of the SRO program this current year. So there was an accelerated exit from our school resource officer program, and that's where that reduction is. And then transfers in, that is our CDBG funds, Housing Finance Assistance Fund, Stormwater, Water and Sewer funds are all budgeted in transfers in. And you see a major decrease from FY20 to the FY21 budget, and that's where we moved economic development loan funds to balance the budget. We moved $4 million. So that's the significant difference there. Then on expenditure side, there's no major changes at this point, and transfers in and out is just going to change as we go because that's where most of our grant funds is budgeted. So use of fund balance on your sheet, I think I pulled up my old sheet, but the 5.43 million would be down here, and so for several fiscal years we will have been using fund balance, and according to our CFO, rating agencies will look at that for multi-year use of fund balance, and so we really need to be conscious of using fund balance going forward in future fiscal years. So this slide shows our, I'm sorry, let me just move on. This slide is our FY22 general fund. So this is your expenditures over revenues. And so right now we're showing a $14.5 million gap. So the light blue column that shows our expenditures, the next slide shows you what the drivers are in the expenditure side. So we're looking at 2% merit for all employees, and that's $2 million, a net increase. When we say net, that factors in retirements and attrition and things like that. And so $2 million if we add back a 2% merit for all employees. There's a recycling contract. We actually don't know the exact amount at this time. The operations director is currently reviewing that and will give us an update, but at minimum, that contract will cost over $1 million. We've also included a 2% supplemental, public safety supplemental pay that we've done over the last several fiscal years. That will be effective January 1st of 2022. And the cost of that is $800,000. 1% public safety supplemental pay is $800,000, and that will be effective July 1st of 2021. I apologize, I updated a slide. So there's one other item I want to add. What's in here? Okay, so we've got the 1% public safety supplemental adjustment. That's effective January 1st of 2021. So half a year would be $400,000, but the full year impact is $800,000. And then we added staffing and operating costs for fire station number 13. So as you recall, when we were planning to add Fire Station 13, that the safer funded positions would then move to Fire Station 13. The fire department is requesting to retain the safer grant positions and then add positions to staff Fire Station 13. So a half-year cost to do that would be $750,000. Obviously, a full-year cost would be over $1.4 million or so. So the Office of Performance and Accountability is currently working with the fire department on staffing requirement, and so that number and the need to add additional positions, we'll have a report on that probably by our early forecast in February. And then we're also adding the parking fund subsidy. If we reinstate that, that's $500,000. So those are the major drivers on the expenditure side. Okay. So on the property tax side, on the revenue side, looking at property taxes right now, the FY22 assumes a 1.77% growth above estimated year end. And so, that's an average right now. Obviously, this is really early, and so we'll get updates from the tax office. This is also a countywide reappraisal year starting in 2021. We have met with John Burgess, that's over the tax office, and he has said he's willing to meet and present to council about the reappraisal process. So that will probably happen in January, where he can give an update on that. And so this number will change as we get new information as well. For sales taxes, it assumes no growth above projected year end, and so that'll get us $2.8 million. And then we are not anticipating any user fees. So just a reminder of the parking reserve fund. You also saw this in the revenue update. FY21 is where we go below the line. So current year in our budget in the expenditure side, we actually added a subsidy of $250,000 and then the projected $500,000 for FY22. So this slide is our Winston-Salem Transit Authority fund reserves. As you see that we are essentially falling off the cliff somewhere around 2023, maybe a little bit sooner. This is all contingent on the state. The SNAP funding, the light blue line is if there is no additional SNAP funding for FY21. The gray line is if there's no SNAP funding for any future years. And so we would go below the line sooner if the state decides not to give us any additional SNAP money. SNAP stands for State Maintenance Assistance Program. As you recall, WISTA received over $12 million in CARES Act funding. And so I believe the state considered that when they decided to, or considering not giving the SNAP money. And so that has been the factor that most transit authorities got some CARES Act relief. So on the occupancy tax by month, you can see from June to September, it's relatively flat. Compared to our FY20, we are significant below our normal revenues for occupancy tax. I'll just make a note that occupancy tax fund includes 4 community agencies. The Piedmont Film Commission, the National Black Theater Festival, River Run, and Old Salem are all funded under occupancy tax. So it's just worth noting. We'll just keep track of how those revenues continue to come in. So that ends the general overview of the early forecast, and I'll be glad to answer questions in a minute. But this is a preliminary budget review calendar. So typically, as I mentioned, we have our early forecast in February. And so right now that date is February the 8th. On April 12th, we'll have a trial balance budget for the FY22 budget year. On Thursday, May 20th at 4 o'clock, there'll be a presentation of the proposed budget to the mayor and city council. In that presentation, you'll get a budget overview, actual budget document, and then the capital plan. On Thursday, May 27th, there will be a finance budget workshop, and that's where we'll review the community agencies. And then later that evening, we'll have the public hearing for community agencies. On June the 3rd, there will be a finance committee budget workshop where the committee will consider and recommend property tax rates. And then on June the 21st, we are projecting there will be a second public hearing and the budget would be adopted. So this is the preliminary calendar. Right now, all of these meetings are projected to be virtual unless the council changes that. So Mayor, that ends the early budget forecast presentation.
Thank you, Ms. Tony. Before we go into questions, I think the city manager wanted to add a couple of comments.
Good evening, Mayor Joines, Mayor Pro Tem Adams, members of City Council, and council members elect. I just wanted to point out, if you look at the math here, you think, okay, well, revenues are up a little bit next year and expenditures are up, but there's nothing really drastic in there as far as the expenditures. It's really kind of normal operations. Why do we have such a big gap next year? The bottom line is we balanced last year's budget with about over $9 million, Ms. Tony, in reserves between the general fund reserves and the $4 million that we were fortunate to get from the sale of the Nissen building. And so that we start with that $9 million hole on our revenue side. And that's why instead of having what we typically might have of maybe a $4 or $5 million early gap, we're looking at this very difficult $14.5 million gap. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Mr. Garrity. Any questions for Ms. Tony? Thank you. Councilmember Adams.
Yes, Ms. Tony and city manager and staff. Again, thank you all for the job that you do during these times to help us understand the decisions that we're going to have to make. We all thought this year was hard. We all thought 9, 10, 11 was hard, but next year is going to be harder. And Ms. Tony, I would like to ask, is it possible, again, when I started asking for these budget updates so the council could see where we are versus get the budget season and everybody be surprised. Is it possible to do a scenario of the worst, the good, the bad, and the worst? Is it possible for you to look at your staff doing that for us? Again, where is the 14 million going to come from? You know, what are the hard case scenarios or decisions that we may have to make? You know, I know we ultimately decide where the cuts will come if we can't make, if the world doesn't flip around in 2 months and help us get this money. What are some, and I'm hoping you'll check again with your colleagues across the country or state as to what they're looking at, as to where these cuts, and we might as well call them cuts because that's what it is, where are these cuts going to come from? And you don't have to tell us now, but I'm asking you and the financial subject matter experts, at least go look at that for us. And Ms. Saunders, also give us the case or the scenario of what happens if we, again, the agencies or organizations that allow us to have such a high credit rating, what could happen to us on a bad side? I think for me, those are the things that I need to start seeing now that I know where this is going. And again, after being on some calls today and Zoom meetings, where all this is going. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, let's, Councilmember Betsy, I believe, had a comment.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Mayor. Ms. Tony, thank you for a thorough presentation. May I look back at your projection for the year end of the general fund in the current fiscal year? You noted, as I read it, a projected additional $1 million gap due to the fairgrounds subsidy.
Page 13.
Pardon?
Page 13.
Yeah. And I wondered whether there was, in theory, any reduction of that subsidy that the council could choose to take in January to soften that blow. For example, if there were planned discretionary maintenance upfits, that kind of thing that the council could postpone and reduce the additional hit on the general fund reserves.
That is, thank you, Councilmember Bessie. That is definitely possible. We'll look into that. But the other thing is it's still early. We can also look at expenditures and slowing down on the expenditure side as well. And there may be other opportunities. I mean, we always can pray for additional CARES Act relief funding if that's possible. So we'll monitor both revenues and expenditures, throughout the fiscal year. By February, hopefully even this chart will look a little bit better, where we may be able to somehow absorb the $1 million for the fund ground subsidy in our existing budget. So I imagine this will look a little bit better. And to Mayor Pro Tem Adams' point, I think what we tried to do in this forecast, even this $14.5 million gap, it's large, but we wanted to look at all potential expenditures that may hit the budget and make you aware of what's kind of coming up. And so we will hopefully get that down some, but you are absolutely correct. This is a large gap, and at some point, staff will have to come back with recommendations on cuts and how we can look at FY22.
Well, thank you. And certainly I would hope that the legislature would choose to restore the SMAP funding for transit systems across the state next year as well. By that time, they'll have an opportunity to recognize whether or not the Congress is coming through with an additional round of CARES funding that could be partially applied to transit subsidies. And if that doesn't transpire, they then could take that, hopefully would take that into account in their budgeting for next year. But the reason I asked specifically about the fairground subsidy is because I know that when the current budget was passed at the end of June, there was no way to know that we would not be having a physical fair this year. And so hopefully that there are anticipated expenditures there that did not take place that would constitute a low-hanging fruit for the council to consider for some immediate savings without actually cutting any services or personnel. But that's just why I flagged that one. Again, since I won't be here as a council member in January, it occurred to me, so I thought I'd throw it out for y'all's consideration later. Thank you.
Councilman McIntosh had a question or a comment?
Yeah, we've got three questions real quickly. First is, I wanted to echo Mayor Pro Tem's question about the consequences of dipping below that 8% threshold. Seems to me like everybody in the country, every municipality in the country is going to be facing a similar obstacles that we are. I just look for your guidance on whether or not we're going to get hammered as we would if we weren't all in the same boat. And I can take that answer later. Number two is I'd like from staff to find out how much money would be generated by raising our parking rates from 25 cents an hour to 50 cents an hour. Don't think that will negatively impact too many people, but could contribute to that bottom line on that parking fund. And then third is, as we look at cuts, this is more a comment, I want to make sure that we think about where we're cutting and what the impact is on the revenue side. For instance, TDA, any funding that we do with them, that they bring in money. So I would hate to see us step back on any funding for that. And then I think we need to look at our inspections division. Right now, we are booming in the house building business, and we are starting to impact their ability to get housing done because of our staffing levels. That generates money. It generates housing for, it helps our affordable housing side. So I think we need to be very conscious about maintaining the sources of revenue that we have, because that does bring money to the bottom line in multiple layers, both from fees, but also from labor in the labor department. So I want us to be very conscious of where we make our cuts.
Thank you, Mr. McIntosh. Councilor Scipio, had a comment?
Yes, I have a couple of questions. I'm concerned about our general fund balance reserve policy. And I just needed to know, at one point it was at 10% up until 2012, and then it raised up to a higher level. So do we make that decision on what percent we're going to maintain?
Yes.
That's okay. And right now we're back down at 10. And do we know how much money is actually in our general fund balance? And what would it take to go down to 8%? How far are we from getting to the 8%?
Okay, so Councilmember Scipio, this is our general fund balance. So currently we have 49 million. However, only 21.5% is our unrestricted general fund balance. And so going back to the slide you were referring to in terms of our history, if we indeed used our $1 million this year, the gap that I showed, which would be 1 million plus the 5.4, that would put us down to 9.6%. So we haven't gotten into our kind of winter storm season, or there's any other catastrophe that happens that puts us down to our legal limit of 8% really quickly. So we are really close. Lisa may want to jump in, but I think the GFOA has best practices, best practices, and they suggest 2 months of reserves, which would be actually 16% is ideal to have in our reserve. So our policy is at 14%, ideally 16%, and currently we're at 10. And if we stay on the same trajectory for this current year, we'll be at 9.6.
And my next question is the minimum wage increase that we voted to start, I think in January, is that in the budget you presented?
That's in the base, yes, it's in the base budget.
Okay, thank you.
14.31 cents an hour.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yes, Councilman Clark.
Just a couple quick comments. First off, Ms. Tony, at your convenience, I think it'd be good to give the council some information on that I think it's 22 million restricted. Exactly what that is. Number two, I would like an opinion, I guess this is for Ms. Saunders. Do we have any general obligation or revenue bond covenants that require us to keep so much balance? And are there state laws that require it? And third, I will just make the comment, Ms. Tony, if you go back to the chart that showed the 10% going to 12 to 14, I think it was page 13, I think they said. Yeah. Keep in mind, if we had not been frugal and gotten it up to 18%, you see back in 2014, I think that is, we're now down to 10. If we'd have kept it at 10, we'd be at 2% now. So there is a reason there are rainy days. We're right in the middle of a hurricane, I think, in the financial area. So back then when we thought we had way too much, we have already, and assuming we go down to 9 this year, we've cut it in half, and that $14 million gap, we may not have any option to go any lower than the 8%, which would just be a huge, huge impact. So I would just remind everybody to watch our dollars, pay attention, and we will have a very interesting spring. Thank you. Thank
you, Councilman Clark. I know your committee is going to have a fun budget season there.
Mayor, this is Lisa. Can I add one thing? There was a lot of about the 8%. The 8% is state law. If we drop below the 8%, the LGC would be talking to us about where our reserves are. The reason we moved over time to 10 to 12.5 to 14 is we were trying over time to get basically 2 months reserve of expenditures for a day today, that we would have the extra money to, to dip into reserves for COVID. So that's really where we are. We don't have any specific bond covenants on our general obligation bonds when it comes to the amount that we need to have, in our unassigned fund balance, other than there are many other metrics out there that, that we would be, coming up to. So I do think it's just really important that we look at 2022 budget, and we don't budget fund balance. We need to cut expenditures this year, and we need to put money back in our savings account. It's just, think of it more simply like your savings account at home. We need 2 months budget in our savings. If you compare us to other local governments, Raleigh, Charlotte, Durham, they're all looking at fund balance policies of either 14 or 16%. And the only one that has published their data yet is Raleigh. Raleigh is sitting at 17% right now. So we are much less than that.
Councilman Parman, you got a question or a comment?
Just a quick comment. So I'm just like Councilmember Bessie. I know I'm gonna be gone, but I got to speak my piece. I know when I got on this city council board on June 15th, we had a whole conversation about this $1 million and monies, because it was talking about the budget. And all of the council members said, if we have an extra $1 million, we would do this. We also said, as a city council board, if we have extra monies, we'll put it back into the fund balance. So what happened that we didn't do that when we got the extra monies, knowing that now we're on borderline of pretty much, so I'm always going to say, we don't have extra money to be throwing around because we're missing in a deficit. So it's time to start, like Mayor Pro Tem say, have those hard decisions that we have to make. And I understand that we want to do certain things, but do we actually have the financial resources to be able to do this stuff? But when I'm saying stuff, I'm gonna call it what it is, pet projects. Just to say we done something, but we don't throw away money that we do not have. And we're talking about $14.5 million gap from revenue and expenditures. We talking about we finna be close to 8% if we have a bad storm, whether it's an ice storm, whether it's a hurricane coming or anything. So when you're talking about losing dollars, why not take the money that we have ready to give out and say as a council, look, we did say if we had that monopoly money, we'll play with it, but we don't have the monopoly money. Put the money back in the revenue where it need to be. Now that's the truth. Put it over there in the fund balance, let it sit there, leave it alone. It's okay if we can't fund those 5 things that we were talking about doing with the CERT committee, because ultimately at the end of the day with that CERT committee stuff, that's just the RFP that's going back to the same organizations that we just gave money to back in April when we had a committee that did it for the COVID money. Now we're going to do another $1 million for the COVID money. And then we'll be doing an RFP again or community agencies to apply for this money. So you're getting double dipping pots everywhere and we broke. We don't have the money to give out to the people. Stop giving it to them. That's my truth. I know y'all don't like it. Hey, at this point, I'm out of here December the 7th, but I had to speak my piece on this. Stop just giving away money that we do not have.
Thank you, Councilman Parman.
Don't deal with nobody.
Thank you, Councilman Parman. Councilman Larson had a comment.
Could I ask Lisa a question? How's our property tax revenues coming in, and are we anticipating any shortfall because of the pandemic? And if the county doesn't collect what they say they're going to collect and pay to us, what happens then?
Councilmember Larson, as you know, as of the fiscal year, we were behind a very small percentage, but I would say for the most part, our property taxes are being transmitted to us from the county this fiscal year on a very nothing abnormal basis at this point.
We're projecting a small increase next year, I notice, from 109 to 111. Basically, is that feeling pretty comfortable about that in view of the current economy?
I think so.
Okay, thank you. Big chunk of our revenue. Yeah.
Thank you, Councilman Larson. Folks, we could talk about this for a long time. We're going to pick it up again, obviously, more detail in February. So if it's okay, we'll move on to the final category we're going to talk about is the community agency funding process. And I believe Mr. Scott Tesh is going to lead the discussion there.
Good afternoon, Mayor Joins, Mayor Pro Tem Adams, members of the City Council, and council members elect. We are going to talk about what is often called a small percentage of the annual operating budget. This is going to be a follow-up conversation to the conversation we had at Finance Committee and also one-on-one with council members. And so, Patrice, if you'll go to the next slide for me. The agenda is going to include looking at the alternative responses, ideas that we reviewed with each council member. Three in particular that there appeared to be consensus from the mayor and city council on in terms of looking at as potential changes to the community agencies process, those being tying amounts to funding streams, or more specifically, looking at how do we look at the total amount of funding to community agencies as a percentage of some type of revenue and standardizing it, capping city contributions to agencies either on a flat maximum in terms of dollars or on a percentage of agency budget, allocating specifically to strategy areas. We're also going to provide you some benchmarking information. We did a survey of Raleigh, Durham, Greensboro, and Charlotte. So we'll provide some benchmarking information from them and talk about next steps and direction that we need from City Council if you'd like to see an action item related to any of these. So again, these are the 9 alternatives that we discussed at Finance Committee, and then in our one-on-one meetings. You will see the top 3 there that I just went over received basically a consensus, and so those are the 3 that we're going to focus on. The other areas, having a third or fewer of the council members appearing to provide support for them, and I will note in those conversations that there were places where someone said, I could support that, but there were conditions to the support. So staff did our best in recording your responses. But obviously those top 3 are the ones that we're going to talk about because we had some type of consensus around them. Patrice, if you'll go to the next slide, please. So tying funding to revenue streams, and we're going to talk about this in terms of the general fund, the occupancy tax fund, and the housing finance assistance fund. Just like those conversations we had in one-on-ones, the federal pass-through grants through CDBG and ESG, we're not going to talk as much about in terms of general process here. If you wanted to see action items when they come back, we could include recommendations for those as well. But in terms of the general fund, current appropriations to community agencies, just under $830,000 a year, which is equal to about a third of a penny on the tax rate. You see there 0.36 cents on the tax rate. So if we were to tie community agency funding to the tax base, that's roughly what you would have. And then you see average growth there of just over 2% for the last 4 non-revaluation years. Property tax-based growth is probably the easiest thing to tie it to. It has a constant growth rate, doesn't move as much as some of our other revenues. We will see in the benchmarking where one of the other cities uses something else, and we can talk about that. So in terms of the Housing Finance Assistance Fund, current appropriations to community agencies for the FY21 budget for just over $450,000. In discussions and looking at the benchmarking information, we'll show you the recommendation here would probably be to use the same type of growth you used in the general fund for these Housing Finance Assistance Fund community agencies. Also knowing that there are potential revenue stream problems in terms of available fund balance and funding in future years in the Housing Finance Assistance Fund. So it might be good to have equity with these community agencies the same way that you had in funding the general fund agencies. And the third one there, and Ms. Tony talked about occupancy tax revenues last year and this year, but the hotel motel tax helps roughly $375,000 in appropriations for those 4 community agencies that she noted. That table over there to the right, I'd like to draw your attention to it. In a normal year, our practice has been to increase the community agencies funded from that pot, from the occupancy tax fund, by the increase in occupancy tax revenues. And so you see in 2018 and 19, roughly that 7 or 8% range. Actual revenues in occupancy tax were down 17% for the fiscal year 20 and projected to be down another 12% on top of that for the fiscal year 21. And we obviously don't know how that's going to end with the pandemic continuing. So with our practice of using the increase in occupancy tax revenues as a way of allocating funding, that may work well when times are good, but when times are not so good, it doesn't appear to work quite as well. So we may also look at providing for some type of equity amongst the occupancy tax funded community agencies as well. So next slide, please. We'll talk about some of the benchmarking information, how other cities are doing this. I will note Durham's not going to appear on many of these slides. The city of Durham during the Great Recession noted that they got rid of their open community agencies funding process. So they still do fund about $2.1 million worth of community agencies every year, but they are the same agencies every year, don't make substantial changes to it, and do not have an open application process by which other agencies can apply. So for Raleigh, when we talked about there was a city that was using another funding mechanism, Raleigh is basically using population growth or per capita. So they have a $5 set aside per capita for their arts community agencies, which is administered by the Raleigh Arts Commission. The note there, it's other leases and contributions. They do have a little bit more than $5 per capita, but generally they do that. They adjust their other agency budgets based on that population growth, which is roughly based on census data, about 1% per year. So we were talking about property tax-based growth of 2%. We would grow at if we use that. On a per capita basis, Raleigh is growing at about 1%. So a little difference there in terms of total funding and how it would move or increase from year to year. I note that Raleigh also adds additional general fund support. So on top of the per capita money, if they choose to, they also just appropriate additional funding in the general fund to support what the council deems appropriate that year. Raleigh does not have any kind of revenue stream tied to their CDBG funding. They have just a flat amount of $200,000, which is an increase from $150,000 in prior years. So they just had a flat amount that they're using there. Charlotte and Greensboro both responded that they really don't tie anything to funding streams, other than Charlotte noting that they give a substantial portion of their occupancy tax funds to the Tourism Development Authority and also to their public assembly facilities. Charlotte is a little different from us, where we get a much smaller portion of the county occupancy taxes. Charlotte is the main distribution for occupancy taxes in their jurisdiction, and so they get in and then re-grant $17 million back to the TDA locally. So that's kind of the way that other cities are doing it. You can see there Raleigh has a little bit of a tie, and the others really don't tie the revenue streams to their community agencies. So next slide, please. The second idea that we're going to talk about in terms of alternatives, we're capping contributions to community agencies, again, either on a dollar threshold or a percentage threshold. We're going to talk about what the other benchmarking municipalities are doing here. So Patrice, if you'll go to the next slide for me. Charlotte and Greensboro, again, not capping community agencies. They're allowed to, through the process, apply for any amount that they would like. Raleigh has a kind of a twofold limit. No community agency is allowed to apply for more than 25% of their prior year organizational expenditures. So they basically have a 25% budget cap at the organizational level. They also have a 50% project or program cap within their human services area. So the 25% of the organization applies overall, and then in their human services category, they have an additional cap. The difference there being you could have a $40 million organization that provides a $100,000 program. So they might easily meet the 25% threshold cap, and may be more difficult depending on program size with the 50% cap. So we've got a couple of scenarios that we're going to show you on how, if we were to apply specific caps, how that might affect current agencies. Patrice, if you'll go to the next slide. So in terms of using a flat dollar cap, if we were to use a $50,000 threshold, which is a number that at least one or two council members threw out in our one-on-one meetings, the table below is designed to show you who that would affect, again, in the general fund, occupancy tax fund, and housing finance assistance funds. You would have several of the larger agencies. Obviously, that right column of annual difference would be how much money they would potentially lose if you were to cap contributions to $50,000. At the bottom of the table, you would see that there are essentially 22 agencies that receive less than $50,000 and would not be affected by this cap. So again, the Arts Council, Old Salem, Callidium, the Summer Youth Employment Program, Bethesda Center, National Black Theater Festival, ESR, those agencies receiving more than $50,000 could get anywhere from a $16,000 to $167,000 cut if you were to implement a flat max. The next slide is going to be if we were to implement a 25% organizational budget max. This tends to hurt or affect the smaller agencies more so, where the flat cap would have affected the larger agencies. So we see here NABVETS, Liberty East, the Drug Treatment Court, Eureka Ministries, and IDR are all currently receiving appropriations that would be more than 25% of their organizational budgets. Cuts here ranging from $1,200 up to just north of or around $26,000. If you were to look at this slide, the annual difference there totaling all of them, only $61,000. In the prior slide, you would have seen that hundreds of thousands of dollars would have been changed under a flat cap. Again, 25 agencies unaffected by this who received $1.5 million with aggregate budgets for those agencies being almost $100 million. So the flat max hurts or would affect the larger agencies. The percentage would probably, as you see, using 25%, affect some of the smaller agencies. Next slide, please. Again, we're going to look at funding by strategy or program area, and who does that. So again, the benchmarking information, what the other cities are doing here. Raleigh has a couple of areas. So we talked about the arts, where they're providing $5 per capita. They have a very broad human services category. They have what they call community enhancement, but that's that $200,000 in CDBG funding we identified earlier. And then they really have a catch-all category that is other outside agencies. So while they've created several of these program areas, they then have a catch-all where they can fund essentially anything that they want. So they have some very broad categories here. Charlotte's, if you were to look at their budget document, doesn't really do this. They responded to the survey saying they didn't, and the breakout is just by funding type. So they have general fund, dedicated revenue source, which was really their occupancy tax fund, their federally funded things, and then you see PAYGO there, and they also have a category called out of school time partner, and that one is related to providing programming during the school year for after school programming and programming during summer and holiday and winter breaks. But most of their categories not related to the type of program, just the type of revenue that's being used to fund the program. Greensboro, again, no specific programs, much more akin to what we have in terms of an open application process, whereby anyone that's a 501c3 essentially can request funding from the city. Based on our current community agencies and who receives contributions, if we were to look at categories for funding, these are the ones that staff might recommend in an action item to come forward. Arts, innovation, human services, community development, and tourism. Again, that community development one most likely dealing more with our CDBG and ESG funding. But this would cover a majority of the fund or of the community agencies that currently receive funding. Again, we could, if the council so chose, look at specific percentages to allocate or dollar amounts, but these would be the types of categories we would most likely be looking at if we wanted to do program areas. Next slide, please. Just generally, I wanted to provide some other information that came out of the survey that we did. Greensboro, Charlotte, and Raleigh all put in the survey information that more than 90% of the agencies that they fund are funded each year and roughly at the same levels as the prior year. So although they may have different processes than what we have, they are getting somewhat of the same result in terms of funding the same community agencies at roughly the same levels. There was a trend in the other cities looking at transitioning away from an open community agency process to contracts for services in certain areas. Would define here a contract for service is much more akin to a department providing a service via an RFP directly rather than through an open community agencies process. Predominantly, these were in housing and economic development. And when we talk about economic development for business retention and those types of things, business recruitment, we saw specific contracts with agencies for that rather than making them apply for funding. Durham, who didn't show up much in the benchmarking because of not having an open process, also mentioned that they had done this in housing and economic development as well. And the final note there, the one thing that popped out in terms of funding was that all cities were funding their local arts councils, and also including Durham, giving directly to those. So that was the only agency where we saw everyone seem to be doing the same thing, wasn't funding local arts councils. Next slide. If you would like staff to do any additional research, you have any additional questions, what we're doing or what may be happening in other jurisdictions, we'd be more than happy to look into that. And really at this point, looking for some direction from City Council on whether you would like to see an action item coming back through Finance Committee that would look at changing the policies related to any of the three alternatives that we discussed today.
Thank you, Mr. Tash. Any questions, Mr. Tash, at this point? Just would say that, the setting a maximum amount to me is just an arbitrary number and would have devastating effect on our community in terms of our quality of life if we did it, as you saw from the numbers there. I do like the idea of tying any expenditure growth to our property tax or there's some standard that we could look at there and making sure that they're all aligning to our program areas. But I don't think you want to be just arbitrary and set a number, because you're trying to really mesh up the desires and needs of your community with the funding there. And I was pleased to see that all of our major cities are strongly funding the arts there. Mr. Larson, I believe you had a comment.
Yeah, Judge, could you tell me what the current per capita expenditure is for Winston-Salem compared to the Raleigh $5 capita? Where are we sort of on that scale?
I can get that information back to you. I have to add those three together and then divide it by roughly 250,000.
Right.
And scratch that number out when the next question comes in.
Okay, that's fine. I'd just be curious, as we're comparing, trying to figure out where we are on the scale. And as we look to trying to supplement what areas we want to supplement. I do like the idea of looking at property taxes as some mechanism to build in a mechanism showing commitment to our arts and social services organizations.
Thank you, Mr. Larson. Councilman Adams, or excuse me, Mayor Pro Tem Adams had a comment.
Thank you, Mayor. I think what this is going to do, because again, there's going to be some difficult decisions that we have to make next year. And this is part of that process. I don't think anyone, any organization, any part of our operations or anything, again, unless there's an infrastructure bill and the money comes down, the CARES heroes and, like rain. But I think where we are right now is, to me, Mayor, members of the council and staff, all indications are telling me that this is just a to what we're going to have to do as we move into January, February, March. If anyone on this council thinks that we can fund people the way we did last year, the year before, I don't see that happening. I think, thank you, staff, this gives us another opportunity to look our challenge straight in the eye and know that everybody's going to have to, unfortunately, feel the pain of this virus. Thank you.
Councilmember Clark and then Councilmember Parman.
Yeah, I just say quickly, it's kind of what the mayor said. What we traditionally do is set a dollar amount and then we kind of fight it out to see who gets what. But if we did anything differently, I would suggest we just take a % of the property tax or the budget or whatever, because that's the controlling factor. And for example, this coming year, we may have to say, well, we're going to do 10% less than we did last year. And then how we fund within that is up to council, and that's part of the decisions we have to make. But I agree with the mayor. I think you have to be very careful on being too arbitrary. And the example I would give is the Arts Council, which is actually a consortium of probably 15 or 20 different organizations. And instead of all paying individually, they apply collectively. And I'm afraid, Scott, I'd be interested in that number, but I'm guessing if we do $1 of citizens to the arts, that'd be 250,000. That would be, I think, about where we are.
Yeah, 20% Probably does.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Councilman Clark. Councilman Parman?
So I agree with Mayor Pro Tem and Councilmember Clark, but also we have to understand we can't keep funding all of them the same amount every year. Like at some point in time, when are we teaching people to be able to sustain themselves? Are we letting Winston-Salem be the last resort to come and getting this funding, or are we the sole primary contributor to just that organization? So not even just looking at the larger companies or nonprofits, but even the smaller ones to say, hey, at some point in time, we can't keep doing milk, but we got to do steak and potatoes. So you can't keep being the gatekeepers of all of these different nonprofits. They have to be able to sustain themselves.
All right. Thank you. So I think, Mr. Tesh, what I'm hearing from council is that there's a indication that we'd like to tie expenditures to revenue growth of some sort and to something we can kind of base that on a year-to-year basis. I agree. We probably going to have to be some haircuts this year as the budgets are being looked at. And certainly I believe I heard tying to program areas as well. We can be, council members said, okay, we can certainly digest this and provide additional feedback to the city manager and to Mr. Tesh. So I'm seeing some thumbs up on that. So without objection, council members, this is a committee of the whole. It's a little bit not quite as formal as some of our other meetings there. Would wonder if any council member wanted to make a comment before we adjourn. Everybody hungry?
Now, Mayor, I would say, like, hey, you might want to start getting your mind right. Get your mind right, because we're going to have to make some tough decisions. And we probably going to fall out like family at the family reunion and cookout, but we'll be okay.
All right. I would entertain a motion that we adjourn the committee of the whole meeting, special meeting of the council.
So moved. Second.
Motion and a second. All those in favor of adjourning, please indicate by saying aye.
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 Any opposed, no. And that is unanimous to adjourn. Thank you, council members. Happy Thanksgiving.
Thank you. You too.